Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Age of Romance, a discussion on romantic literature. This week, the topic of discussion is romantic novels, romance, the love and romanticisms between two people, and so on. So, today we'll be deep diving into the genre of romance, romantic settings, characters, and romanticisms that ensue. And before that, let me introduce my panel to you. Joining me from Bangalore is my constant panelist, Abhinav Bhattacharya.
Hello,
Good evening, Abhinav. How are you?
evening. I'm good.
Thank you. And joining us alongside Abhinav is a very, very special guest, also from Bangalore. We have Jaslein Mahil. Hi,
Hi,
Jaslein. How are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. So, before we move ahead in this discussion, Jaslein, would you like to introduce yourself to our viewers?
All right. Hi guys, my name's Jasleen. I have been around on the planet for around 25 years now. I am half Punjabi, half Malayali, and both my folks were in the army, so I've stayed pan India. It's been a very interesting life. Work-wise, I've been a journalist and a publicist so far, and hopefully I'll write books someday.
Yeah, hopefully all of us will be writing books. Abhinav has already written one, but yeah, he's not going to stop there. So hopefully all of us will be writers and authors one day.
Yeah.
So let me kickstart this discussion for this evening. Let's begin with the evolution of romance as a genre of literature. Where, and when did it begin? Abhinav, I'd like to start with you.
Totally, Akash. And it's a quintessential genre in itself. Romance is at times not just a genre, but a language, to be precise. And in terms of English literature, initially it took shape as a subgenre in terms of medieval or medieval romance as literature, and a style of heroic prose and verse narrative based in Europe from the Middle Ages to the times of Renaissance. And in the later, I would say, the latter part of 18th century, romance as novels took shape in the literary genre, developed, of course, in the Western culture, which focuses on the romantic relationship between two or more people. But it would be very unkind, if to the rest of the world, if romance was a Western genre. But yes, due to cultural limitations and lack of documentations worldwide, I believe throughout ages, I believe we still don't know its real origins other than what we get on the internet. And the romance as a genre, I would say, includes verse or prose works dedicated to idealism and often associated with love and daring deeds. However, by the late 18th to the mid 19th century, I would say Gothic writers adopted the genre and steered the romantic flights of fancy in a much darker direction, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was quite interesting for me.
Absolutely.
My take overall.
Okay, Jasleen, I'd like to come to you for that response, for that question, to that question.
Yeah, I think Abhinav takes you through the initial half pretty well because there was a thriving works that was conventionally referred to as romance novels, which existed in ancient Greece. But whatever we know in terms of the origin of romance is basically what we find on the internet, whatever has been documented or whatever survived. I think I'd like to maybe look a little into how romance has evolved past the 1900s, which
Yeah,
is when Milton Boone comes into play. So Milton
absolutely.
Boone was founded sometime in the early 1900s, and they started releasing romance novels around the 1930s. Their books were sold in North America by Harlequin, and like that sort of was the beginning of direct marketing to readers and allowing mass market merchandisers to carry these books and get them to people. Um, this obviously is like something that has had an impact in terms of how we consume romantic literature, since these were some of also the initial mass market books. Their
Yeah,
permeability and how much of an impact they have had on the genre itself over the years as it has evolved. I think there's something that could be said about that. In addition to this, also there are subgenres in the romance space. There's contemporary romance, historical romance, romantic suspense, paranormal romance, science
yeah,
fiction, fantasy, time travel, multicultural, erotic, and chick lit as well. Uh,
Yeah,
there's a variety of categories here at play. Uh, However, some texts delineating romance have also come out of late, which have incorporated character traits and dimensions outside the damsel in distress, knight in shiny armor dichotomy, or the selfless fixer, redeemable broken partner dichotomy. I feel, for instance, New York Times Modern Love, that
yeah,
column that highlights everyday love stories, you have to always account for pages like these, and how there's so many photography pages online as well with humans of XYZ. The concept which tells you the stories of like love stories of people. I feel the genre is also like evolved into like this digital telling of stories as well. Uh,
yeah,
some of these pages have grown exponentially, but this also
yeah,
means that people are finally realizing the value of representing flawed and real characters in this
yeah,
flawed and real world just the way they are.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you said humans. So, Humans of New York was where it all began. And in India, it took a really good step with Humans of Bombay, and then it went downhill real bad. I don't want
Yeah.
to. I don't want to get into
Let's not
nitty-gritties
go
of,
there.
yeah, because there's no point going. It's really really crass now. Uh, but yeah, moving on. Do you write like reading romantic novels, and do you remember the first romantic novel you ever read? Your first encounter with a romantic novel, Abhinav?
I would say rarely, but yes, I do read once in a while, especially around uh, romance as a genre or novels itself. The first I believe was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, written back in 1813. But I guess still a bestseller. Interestingly, after a century or more of a book being published, generally it ends up in the rustic but yet quintessential Project Gutenberg, a free online bookstore for classics. But yes, still it's considered a bestseller with a solid copyrighted piece. So imagine the time it's been there in the market and the impact on its readers for more than 2 centuries. And it's a showstopper of a novel. Pride and Prejudice is a romantic novel of manners, which is quite interesting. The novel follows the lead character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the dynamic protagonist of the book, who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. Its humor lies in the honest depiction of manners, education, marriage, and money during the Regency era in Great Britain. And that's something which is, of course, quite key to Britain itself. But then overall, if you see, even other communities around the world has adopted it and read it. I believe there are a lot of people who have associated with this book correctly because of the world building which I have mentioned before. So that's what,
Yeah.
and that's my first book.
Okay. Okay. Jasleen, coming to you on this.
Yes. Have I read romance? Yes. I have read a fair amount of the genre. I've been a voracious reader since I was in boarding school, and the first romance novel I had ever read was a Milton Boone. Uh,
Yeah.
it was a patriarchal archetype in terms of how romance should be. Obviously, romance novels weren't allowed in schools, so these weren't books that I found in the library. I borrowed them from a friend back in the day, and
Yeah.
I think there is something that has to be said about how these books sort of influence young minds in terms of how they perceive romance. But luckily, this was not the only exposure I had to romance when I was younger. I have read a fair amount of Eric Siegel as well. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think Eric Siegel's books were a lot more realistic because they had one foot in the world of romance and one foot in the real world. So while in Prizes, Isabel da Costa falls in love with someone, she's also a child prodigy who goes on to win the Nobel Prize for Physics. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think all his characters sort of have this persona and life. You look at their childhood, you look at them evolve into adults. In another book of his doctors, the story revolves around two characters, Barney and Laura, who are from the Harvard Medical School class of one of the batches of the 1950s. But it's beautiful because it also sort of traces their professional journey and everything that happens alongside. So read a fair bit. So I think these are like the initial things that I was exposed to in all of that.
Okay, moving on from books and your relationship with the books, I'd like to move on to another question. Uh, have romantic novels with the quintessential optimistic happy endings messed up with our ideas and of romance in the 21st century? I mean, do you feel that they have set the bar of expectations a bit too high for people? I mean, do you think people are on a lookout for things that might not really exist in the real life when it comes to romance?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Abhinav.
I believe fiction in general is unreal, but not just romance as a genre. Even others, in terms of genre, fiction itself are
Yeah,
unreal. It's totally meant for pleasure only. Sometimes
yeah,
readers are readers, and they try to, associate themselves with unworldly characters which they like from their, favorite authors, and sometimes due to circumstances as well, situational incidents. And also authors exploit it to, demonstrate the power of his or her, content. But yes, I believe, as we have discussed a lot on prior episodes on world building, it's key for the author
yeah.
to the virtual framework for the greater good of the society in general. So that's my take.
Hmm.
Okay. Jasleen.
I believe it's more the content of the story than the ending itself that influences romance. I think it's the tropes, the toxicity, and the redundancy of the tropes, and the repetitiveness of these across time and space. For
Yeah,
instance, it's a very commonly known storyline where you have this young girl who walks into the life of a wealthy man who's lost his wife, a partner, and there's a child that needs looking after. Uh, you see it in Jane Eyre, but there's no mention of the wife in the attic. There's no accountability towards the wife in the attic. The conversation of mental health is missing. If you look at
yeah,
how a similar narrative has been dealt with in a mass market sort of publication, where, like, the books like, say, 100 rupees a copy, because books like these also exist. Over here, you will have this aloof, mysterious anti-hero who recedes into a further lack of communication. And so there's like a lot of emotional stunting and shying away from vulnerability, apart from like a few key moments. And you have like what, 5 key moments, 7 key moments, and all that might be very well for a text, for artistic catharsis, so to speak. But when
yeah,
you're propagating the stereotype of a partner who constantly demands to be saved, or you have to prime him to open him up, it's quite exhausting, because uh, all of these raging romances pile a lot of work and emotional labor onto the female characters, and then pass the burden on to real life women, because there are children who are reading these books with young impressionable minds who have no idea how romance works, how
yeah.
concepts like consent work, how respect works, how tropes like manic pixie dream girl just seep into children's heads, because uh, a manic pixie dream girl trope means you have to be on in a society, and you have to be perfect and the best of everything all the time. This
Hmm.
stifles the expression of identity of the girls who are reading all of these things. They romanticize another identity, and they are brainwashed into buying this perfect ideal. I feel like all of these tropes have a bigger impact on romance and how we perceive romance today, as opposed to the ending itself.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
As a follow-up to that, I'd like to ask another question to you, Jasleen.
Hmm.
These novels and the way, the quintessential optimism and happy endings have given
Hmm.
rise to another set of people who are tagged as the hopeless romantics.
Uh,
Yeah, the
yes.
constantly broken people who are hopeless, who lack hope in one way, but they're still hopeful that one fine day they will find that perfection in their life, that fictional perfection in their life.
Hmm.
They're still waiting for, they're still waiting for to cross the tunnel and to face the light of love and perfect romance. What do you have to say about those hopeless romantics and the hopeless romanticism?
I feel like while hopeless romanticism does exist, what one would want the genre to do is something that I have seen happen in modern love columns on New York Times.
Yeah.
There needs to be an acknowledgement of the fact that while hopeless romanticism is real, life goes on.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just don't end up together, and that's it.
Yeah.
Sometimes that is just it. It's you have to accept facts for what they are. You cannot
Absolutely.
talk somebody into something. You can't fix someone into wanting you. You
Absolutely.
can't turn a person's head around in a certain way. I feel like the toxic aspect of the hopeless romantic angle is where there's this constant dangling of hope that something
Yeah.
might happen in that direction. I feel
Absolutely.
like that's why you're leading the person who's engaging with this narrative on. And if the person who is reading with this narrative identifies and buys into it, then it might be like a lifetime of leading them on.
I
Totally.
mean, you might look for the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel might turn out to be something which is endless.
Or you might end up going somewhere else altogether. For instance,
Absolutely.
sometimes you end up falling in love, and you by the end of it, you end up discovering a whole new side to your personality, or you end up realizing things about yourself that you hadn't realized. It doesn't necessarily have to be a growth with another individual. You can
Absolutely.
you can grow on your own and evolve through this experience as a person, and move on to, like, being a better version of yourself. I feel like that acknowledgement and that narrative is somehow missing in terms of the books that I was exposed to. I'm completely open to the idea that there are other books out there that I have not read which explore this angle. But when I go back to the sort of books that sort of came my way over the last 25 years, I didn't see a lot of that. But I did see this acknowledgement, a subtle hint, or like a subtle nod to the real in the modern love column. And I think that's beautiful.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Justine, for sharing your insight on hopeless romantics and hopeless romanticism. Moving on to the next question. Many romantic novels over the past decades have been adapted into movies. I mean, you had we have, say, Nicholas Sparks' The Notebook, and you have I mean, the most common one, the most popular one was how Pride and Prejudice was adapted uh, into movies and so on. What are your views on that, Abhinav?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say, like, I completely agree with, before answering the question, I completely agree with Jaslein's point of view around, the world building concept of using the correct
Hmm.
trope. If you don't,
Hmm.
how does how is it better for the community as a whole, and
Yeah.
to every segments in society? How do you bring out the genre in the right way? And of course,
Hmm.
yeah, I personally feel romance is better on screen than in text. I would to mention three stark novels, especially uh, during different times, which was written during different times, and how it came up and made a huge impact on screen. The first is the Traveler's Wife, which was the debut novel of American author Audrey Niffinger, published in 2003. Which made a massive impact on screen. I read the book after watching the movie. Uh, Still, it didn't bore me. So that's something that would be my first take. Second, Love in the Time of Cholera, by the infamous Gabriel Garcia Marquez, was quite quintessential in terms of something which again I think I read it before watching. I, this time I had read it before, and it was immaculately written, and also was a box office hit, I believe. The third one, I just want to mention it, not from a very positive construction, but just a literary criticism of the book, by Nicholas Sparks, the one which you have already mentioned. So there are two versions in terms of screenplay today. One from which is a I think quite famous or well-known Hollywood flick, which I didn't like
Hmm.
much. And the second one is not doing that great. It's a Bollywood one, by Mithunda, the infamous Mithun Chakrabarti of India. And the name of that Hindi movie is called Zindagi Tere Naam. But again,
Hmm.
what I wanted to see is, like, in terms of the content, the power that people or producers or director had to, uh, use that particular book to get out content through is something quite
Mm.
interesting. And maybe there'll be better versions in the future, but that
Yeah.
was something which people had, used. And but all in all, there is content more to, grab attention from. So that's my take. And of course,
Okay.
that's something which, in terms of, uh, what I would say is like the first two takes, the Time Traveler's Wife and Love in Time of Cholera. And I would also like to mention one more book which I would like to see as a movie. It's called Half of a Yellow Sun by uh, Chimamanda, Ngozi Adichie. She is a Nigerian, author, and she's quite famous in terms of what content she brings through. She wrote a historical romance, in terms of a complete political history and historical, backdrop of the Biafra War back then. But that has not made into a movie yet. But it's really top there and really up there as in terms of a book which has that potential. So that's me.
Okay. Justine, I'll come to you on this. Like,
Yeah.
what are your takes on the cellular adaptations of romantic novels?
I feel like cellular adaptations tend to oversimplify. That's largely because of a lack of time, because there's an element of time constraint that you sort of tend to struggle with when you're trying to,
Yeah.
put things into a certain time frame.
Yeah.
But I feel books are better than movies on romance. I think
Always.
I owe that to Eric Siegel, because I'll go back to Doctors. So Doctors is a novel he wrote in 1988, and it
Yeah.
deals with the Harvard Medical School class of 1962, with an emphasis on the two lead characters, Barney and Laura. They are neighbors, they are best friends. So you see them go from childhood to adolescence to college, work, and beyond. You also see them make a lot of choices in terms of their love lives, in terms of partners. Partners that it doesn't work out, partners which are toxic, and then your friends are telling you to call it off. You also have a very real world example in terms of, it's very close to how you have friends in the real world who stand by you in extremely tricky circumstances, and your genders are not necessarily the same. It could be an opposite gender best friend. There's like some
Yeah.
level of uh, there's some level of like depth in that regard. I feel these are books that I would love to see adapted on screen. I'd love to see Eric Siegel's prizes adapted on screen. But for to answer this question, maybe there's two movies that stand out for me. Me Before You, which looks at Will and Louisa and accounts for Will's resentment, and it's because of the cards that life has dealt him and his trauma that he wants
Mm.
to take euthanasia as an option and give up on life, and maybe give up on Louisa in the process. And that has nothing
Yeah.
to do with Louisa herself. She did her best. Sometimes you just can't rescue the guy. I'll
Yeah.
take you back to my initial answer where I said that unhealthy trope of a dependent partner that needs to be fixed. I feel like this sort of breaks away from that, because it sort
Yeah.
of acknowledges that both are their own people,
Yeah.
independent of the love. At the end of it, they're both different people. I think
Absolutely.
there's that, and there's also Netflix is the half of it, which is loosely
Mhm.
inspired by Cyrano de Bergerac. It's a 19th century play which revolves around an eloquent but not very good-looking man helping a handsome but uninspired man who a very beautiful girl. But there's a subtle layer over here, because it's a girl who is shy, more mm, I think she's more a nerd than anything else.
Okay.
She's a shy nerd with a slightly complicated family who's helping an uninspired jock woo the most beautiful girl in class. She texts her for him. She talks philosophy, art, music, how they perceive life. It's beautiful, and I think it's also really nice because it looks at diversity. Like, there is an attempt to show me how high school romance works for like a girl who's in love with a girl, because that's something I do not know because I'm personally straight. I think that was beautiful. I quite like the movie because of that.
True.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really sweet. Thank you so much for your insight. And that brings me to the last question of this discussion. This is how I always end my discussions. I want to know what you're reading currently. Abhinav, what are you currently reading?
Currently, I'm on to this one, Akashdeep. So, Captain Corellis Mendelin by the infamous Louis D. Bernays. I had seen the movie before reading this one again, but the movie, I believe, was incomplete. There should be a retake. Uh, and
Oh, nice.
I think the book has a lot of potential for a better movie. But then, what a book! I mean, it of course it got him the Commonwealth Writers Prize back in the day in 1995, and this is something which is completely quintessential in terms of historical romance during war, and that's something really came out well. The infusions, the again the not only just world building, right? Especially the characters, how he portrayed those characters, the angles to the story, and starting from a doctor, the starting tone of the book was completely right in terms of war, and really showed both angles, not just romance, but also came about and talked about the rest of the arenas circling war, so which was key. And that's me. And overall, I would say this is a genre which will always evolve. And as even Jaslein had mentioned, I mean, this is a genre which will always evolve. And let's see 50 years from now, how what sort of a book we are expecting. That will again change in terms of romance
Mhm.
genre. So that is perfect. I mean, it's a quite interesting.
Okay. Jasleen, the last and final answer of this discussion. What are you currently reading?
I am currently reading Foucault's Pendulum. I've had this book lying with me for around 2 years and I have not touched it. I bought it from one of my friends and just never gave it back. And the pandemic has left me alone with these books long enough to make me think, maybe I should read it. It has been lying with me for 2 years now.
Yeah,
I also, to add to what Abhinav said, I think romance does have a long way to go in terms of evolving, because while post 2005 there has been a lot of acknowledgement in terms of mental health,
yeah,
gender identity, and diversity by the genre itself, I feel there are still a lot of toxic stereotypes that are still being propagated, at least
yeah.
on the whole Wattpad aspect. But I think we should take that up for another panel.
Exactly.
Digital literature.
So it's basically just like what Bon Jovi had said. We are halfway there, but we're still living on a prayer. Okay,
Yeah,
that
that's
brings us.
true.
Yeah. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you so much, Abhinav and Jasleen, for joining me.
Thank you.
That was the Age of Romance, and I'm Akashdeep Baruah. Thank you for watching.
Take care. Stay safe.